right. Next person up is Brinnen with From Land to Sea or Sea to Land, Reconciling Key Features of Terrestrial and Maritime Landscapes. Brinnen is the Chief of Resources, thank you, Chief of Resources at Sitka National Historical Park, the only National Park Service unit to commemorate Tlingit resistance to European colonial expansion, the expansion of Tsarist Russia, and the living native culture of Southeast Alaska. Previously, he was the Cultural Resource Program Manager at the Delaware Water Gap National Recreational Area and a museum specialist and archaeologist at the Southeast Archaeological Center. He has always studied the archaeology of submerged sites and has advanced degrees in nautical archaeology and prehistoric underwater archaeology. Welcome.
All right. You'll have to excuse me. I changed my presentation somewhat between when I submitted the abstract and the first version of the presentation till now. So I decided it would be deadly boring to just talk about from land to sea or sea to land. So I couched it in Alaska maritime cultural landscapes. And you'll see me tacking. I'm going to be essentially blown between two winds: the method and theory wind, and the sort of practical, here's the landscaped wind. So you'll see me tack back and forth through the presentation, so stay with me, please. Okay, so I always liked, thinking about this, I wanted to start with a definition because they're all often good to start with. So I found our National Park Service definition of what a cultural landscape is, and I just wanted to go over it for review. It's a geographic area that's either associated with a historic event, activity, or person, or exhibiting some other cultural value or aesthetic value. So you have to meet those basic characteristics. I also went back and reviewed Westerdahl, and he sees it kind of in a more, it's still focused on the past, but it clearly refers to ongoing cultural values. And note that in its definition, it's focused on remains. And the other thing that I've picked up in this is that there may be a subtlety in the Swedish in the word remains that doesn't translate well into English. So if anybody knows Swedish and can look at that word remains, it may have connotations that aren't effectively brought over into the English. So, and it may have as much to do with ethnographic remains as archaeological and architectural remains, which we're, as materialists, all seem to be very interested in. So here I'm tacking back to Alaska, or the practical stuff. Alaska is huge. It's 1.7 million square kilometers. And traditionally, Alaska's population has been really tiny. The first accurate population numbers, well, they may or may not be accurate, are from 1880 when they did the census, and there were 33,000, a little over 33,000 people in Alaska at that point. And even today, there are only 710,000 people, and there's the scale there is deceiving. It's about twice the size of Texas, so keep that in mind. One of the things that a small population in a large area yields is a premium on inter-community awareness and relationships, and also a high degree of mobility and trusted connections across that mobile area, so that you can go a long distance and know somebody in the community that you go to, and that's a trusted person that can put you up, feed you, that type of thing. And I didn't really appreciate that until I moved there because, from the lower 48, you don't really have, your type of community is different. It tends to be much more geographically centralized. You have groups of friends in a local community. Your community doesn't necessarily extend over vast distances into other communities, not necessarily. Another thing is that trade is assumed to be widespread and relatively regular. There's a regular round to Alaskan life where you move from place to place, from a winter quarters to a summer subsistence camp, and so on. And subsistence resources on the other hand, are highly territorial and vigorously defended. In other words, you may have people in other communities that you visit, but when it comes down to the resources you want to harvest for your subsistence, those are very, very territorial in nature. So my objectives of this is to show that Alaska is a cultural landscape, to show that maritime Alaska is a maritime cultural landscape overlaying multiple marine ethnographic landscapes, and to show that the most important aspects of maritime cultural landscapes are overall historical significance and physical integrity, not individual landscape characteristics, which I think are more units of analysis rather than actual items. So I was going to do a little overview, but I'll skip that. Now, this is back on the sort of theoretical side of things. I was really interested in this idea of cognitive landscapes that Westerdahl went into. So I don't know has anyone ever used Google Suggest? Do you guys know what that is? Does anybody know what it is? It's that little, when you punch terms into Google, it automatically shows you a list that you can pick from. Okay? So that's Google Suggest. And there's a great little program online called Seer that will take two Google Suggest terms and compare them and show you the relationship between the terms. Now, it's really useful for marketing because it allows you as a marketer to figure out what people are thinking of or what people are looking for when you put a particular word in there to search for it. So I thought, oh man, this would be a great little tool to figure out what the connections are between cultural landscapes and maritime landscapes. So I started using Seer to see if I could figure out what those relationships were. So the first thing I did is I compared cultural landscapes and maritime landscapes. Now, what things pop out at you right away? There's no relationship. People who are looking for cultural landscapes are not looking for maritime landscapes, and people who are looking for maritime landscapes aren't looking for cultural landscapes. That shows me, or I would conclude from that it's not an overlapping set. So there's not much discussion there. There's not much cognition in the general public about the connection between maritime landscapes and cultural landscapes. The other interesting thing here is, and if anybody here is interested in a job, you notice that like the most common thing that people are looking for when they look for maritime landscapes is services. So you want to start a contract business? I would go into maritime landscape services. Anyway, so like you might imagine, if you think about Westerdahl and Swedish archaeology, maritime landscapes have a very high prominence in Swedish archaeology. So I compared Swedish archaeology and maritime landscapes, and we've got a little bit of a connection. And it's what you might expect. Less connection from Swedish archaeology to maritime landscapes, but quite a bit the other direction. I then looked at the Maritime Sanctuary Program and the National Register Program, and you can see that there is some connection there, but about the same as there you see for Swedish archaeology. Here, this is where it becomes really interesting. Where's Hans? So I thought Alaska and Hawaii are kind of like we're like twin states way out there in the Pacific. We have a lot of cultural connections. So I thought I'd do that. And you can start to see there's a much stronger relationship in Alaska and Hawaii between the concept of maritime landscapes and Hawaiian and Alaskan archaeology. And that's I think, an important point. And I wanted to back-check my information because you start using some of these tools, you don't know what the hell you're doing sometimes. So I checked it again. I checked archaeology and nautical archaeology against each other, and yeah, this kind of makes sense. People are interested in jobs, they're interested in what the salary is, and they're interested in how to get a degree. And my sort of off-the-cuff interpretation of this was everybody's got to make a living, and can I make a living doing either nautical archaeology or archaeology? So with that in mind, I just wanted to review this definition. We've already seen it. Is Alaska a cultural landscape? It's a geographic area. That's absolutely true. I should probably catch up with my, because I've got some. Let's see. It's associated with a historic event. I thought I'd put the check in there that bought Alaska. $7.2 million. And actually, it's funny, I live in Sitka now, and the United States paid about $200,000 extra, over $7 million, because there was an ice plant in Sitka that produced, it was the only source for ice for San Francisco up until the purchase. And so the Russians had been supplying ice for San Francisco, and it was a very lucrative market, obviously. And so they paid extra $200,000 for Alaska just because of that. It's also associated with the resumption of Manifest Destiny and the gold rush, the Western Pacific exploration, and also whaling. We've already talked about that somewhat. And also the expansion of fisheries. So it's definitely associated with an activity, very important activity. It's also associated with one of the most important diplomats in American history, William Seward. He was the visionary leader that had the idea that they could buy Alaska from Russia. And one of the things that he's credited with is reinvigorating the Manifest Destiny, or the prominence of America on the world stage after the Civil War. And Alaska played a major role in that. Now that I think I've shown Alaska as a cultural landscape, I wanted to go over kind of what that landscape looks like. And so I went in and sort of blocked out the area of Alaska where you didn't have a major influence of the sea. And you can see both from the amount of area that is on the coast and connected by the ocean, and also the major river systems in Alaska, that clearly a majority of Alaska, if not two-thirds of Alaska, is all some type of maritime influenced landscape. And that really overlays with a number of language groups and ethnographic landscapes that were very prominent as late as the mid-1700s, and many of them continue today. About 30% of Alaska's population is Native Alaskan, and most of the folks still strongly associate with these basic language groups and cultural groups. So the cultural landscape of Alaska is overlaid on these ethnographic landscapes. When I got to Alaska, we had a couple of projects queued up for funding. One was the Russian Bishop's House Cultural Landscape Report, and the other was, actually we only had that one. So I thought it would be deadly boring to just study the Russian Bishop's House in Sitka, Alaska as a cultural landscape, because it's about an acre of land and one building, no, 3 buildings. There are 3 buildings in a little cluster. So I said, why not repurpose that and talk more broadly about what the ecclesiastical landscape of Russian America would look like, and how would it contribute to the use of the Russian Bishop's House in Sitka. Because we're charged with studying, we're the only unit in the Park Service that studies Russian America, so why not use the cultural landscape money that we get and have a broader focus? So I've right now got a number of folks that are looking at Russian American or Orthodox landscapes all across Alaska, and how they're connected and how they contribute to the significance of the Russian Bishop's House and the landscape in Sitka. The other thing that I was very interested in is expansion of the commercial landscape, and we funded a maritime cultural landscape project to study the commercial landscape of Russian America and the expansion of Russian companies into Alaska. And that includes significant resources like the Erskine House and the Baranof Castle in Sitka. And they both have parallels, so they're going to end up being merged together. So I'm going to tack back and talk about the various things that you would find in a typical cultural landscape. And these are basically characteristics, so I don't think I have to go out through them too intensively. And they're straight from landscape lines, so you can look them up. And I'd also mention that the characteristics of a landscape have changed, so there's an evolutionary aspect to it that's important to recognize. And that means that we can evolve into something else. We can talk about something else if we want to. And I wanted to figure out where Westerdahl fits into maritime landscapes fit into this broad NPS perspective. And the important thing here is that there's some things that change and there's some things that stay the same. And I wanted to use this as an example in Sitka. This is the development of Sitka early on. That area there is from 1804 and this is 1867. So you can see the development of a commercial landscape here, but with elements of it changing and elements staying the same. I think that's important to recognize. So this is just a brief review of Westerdahl's characteristics. So here's kind of the nuts and bolts of the theory part of it. I tried to figure out how these could be merged into some sort of system that would work for maritime cultural landscapes using characteristics from cultural landscapes and some of the maritime cultural landscape features that Westerdahl does. So you have natural features and systems. I thought, you could work that as maritime ecosystems and features. Land use is fishing grounds, coastal industry. Cultural traditions, what Westerdahl would call cognitive landscape, would be maritime traditions and maritime ethnography. You could use circulation, has a kind of a special meaning in nautical terms. And they would be maritime routes and waterside circulation. Westerdahl would call those a network of sailing routes. Topography, essentially we can go through this. I can give you my presentation so you can review them at your leisure. But there are some specific sea terms that I think need to be included and things that are part of a maritime landscape that aren't typically talked about in cultural landscapes. And those are celestial features, what a star field looks like at sea, because it's critical for navigation and wayfinding. And it has special meaning, I think, in the Pacific Islands where there's different systems of navigation. You need to have a special category for winds, waves, currents, and ice. Those are typically used as well for navigation, but are also special conditions at sea. And you also need to have some sort of special consideration of weather, because weather makes all the difference when you're at sea. So with that, I wanted to sort of switch back and talk about significance and integrity. I think significance and integrity are as important or more important than what I've talked about before, because the characteristics are really ontological terms and aren't really a substitute for the actual resources you see in the field. So at some point in the future, you'll see some sort of updating of the Russian-American NHL theme study and to incorporate ecclesiastical landscapes and commercial landscapes of Russian America.